Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I've had it with this dump!
All right. Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast. I am your host, Chad Gross. I am all by myself. Don't worry, I won't sing anymore. Mr. Auten is out doing Mr. Auten things. I don't know what he's doing. We got no food. We got no jobs. Our pets' heads are falling off. I don't know what's going on. But you are with me today, so welcome. We are going to be talking with Eric Chabot today. I love saying that name. I wish I had a cool name. My last name is Gross, and he gets Chabot, which seems unfair, to be honest with you. And we are going to talk to him today about his essay, Does the Resurrection of Jesus Prove He is the Jewish Messiah? That he contributed to a book entitled Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions, Essays in Honor of Frank Turek. Let's get to know Mr. Chabot a little bit. He is the director of Ratio Christi, a national apologetics ministry at The Ohio State and Columbus State Community College. He holds an MA from Southern Evangelical Seminary and is the CJF Ministries Midwest representative in Columbus, Ohio, where he lives with his wife Lucy and two children. And he has spoken and taught at multiple churches and conferences, including the SES National Apologetics Conference. He is the author of The Resurrection of the Jewish Messiah, co-author of Does God Exist? Why It Matters, and Is Jesus the Jewish Messiah? And he blogs at thinkapologetics.com. So before we get to the interview, I did want to drop a bit of a encouragement, advertisement, not sure what you want to call it. Advertisement seems to entail that I'm making some kind of money, which I'm not. But I did want to, I guess, put a plug in, would be a better way to say it, for something on TruthBomb, which is where I blog, truthbomb.blogspot.com, called Worldview and Apologetics in the News. And this is where I collect articles, videos, movie reviews, book reviews, and commentary on cultural issues and apologetic issues. And the goal of this resource is to encourage Christians to be able to think well about things that are happening in the culture from a biblical perspective. And so I encourage you to check that out. And again, my blog is not monetized or anything like that, but I do think it's a resource that would be worth spending a few minutes checking out. So again, that is Worldview and Apologetics in the News at TruthBomb. So let's get to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Eric Chabot, welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast.
Thank you, Chad. Glad to be here.
Yes, I've been following your work for quite some time, so it is so nice to sit down and have a virtual face-to-face. So today I wanted to talk to you about your essay, Does the Resurrection of Jesus Prove He is the Jewish Messiah? And of course, that was included in a book called Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions, Essays in Honor of Frank Turek. So I thought it'd be a great place to start to just talk about how did you get involved in that book?
Yeah, well, there was an email that went out from Clark Bates. Clark Bates is the editor on the book, and I knew who Clark was. I've never met him personally, but I think I've seen his name through the years with apologetic stuff. And he contacted a bunch of people that had been through Frank Turek's Cross-Examiner Academy class, which is something the Cross-Examine the Ministry offers every year for people. Well, I was actually technically in the very first class. That was like way back in like 2008.
Yes.
So I was like one of the guinea pigs. The original, it was a bunch of us there. A lot of people in apologetics were there. You know some of the names, but and I had known Frank for many, many years. I've had him speak at our Ohio State Ratio Christi chapter many times. So I've known him personally for a number of years. And I was like, yeah, I really want to contribute something here if I can. I mean, I really appreciate Frank, and, I think he's done a great job for our chapter here, and he does a great job with Cross-Examine, and I want to do something to kind of honor him. So I told Clark, I'm in. If you want to use me, I'm in. So I just responded, hey, if you need me, I'm here. I'll write an essay. And that was it.
Excellent.
Pretty much the rest is history.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
So before we start talking about the essay, I know that one way I came to know you is just through your post that you share about your ministry on the campus of the Ohio State. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and also a little bit about your involvement with Ratio Christi.
Yeah, well, I started going to the Ohio State University about 2005 as part of an internship for my congregation here. I would just go down there a couple of days a week and do some evangelism. And then I really got excited about it. I mean, Ohio State's a gigantic school. It's got like 64,000 students. So there's a lot of opportunities there. But to make a long story short, an opportunity opened very quickly for me to go full-time as a full-time support-based missionary. And I took from my pastor. My pastor was working for an organization part-time as a missionary, but he stepped away and I kind of took his spot full-time. So he's pastoring full-time, but he didn't want to do that. He didn't have time to do the other stuff. So I took his place and I've been doing it for a while. And then about 2008, 2009, I was enrolled at SES Seminary, getting a master's degree there. And I knew some of the leadership there, and they said, we're starting these Ratio Christi chapters down in North Carolina. And there's a few of them that just started, and they said, you're doing a lot of stuff at Ohio State. Is there any apologetics ministry there? I'm like, no, actually, I've been frustrated. There's really no apologetics ministry. There's like Crew and InterVarsity's other groups, which do a lot of good stuff, but I just didn't see any apologetics presence. And so I volunteered to kind of get a chapter going here to plant one. And so we were technically the fourth chapter to ever start. And so now there's like over 130 chapters. So I grabbed some students. I met some students just out on campus doing some outreach, and they helped me start the chapter, and it's been there ever since. I mean, we've been going steady, strong for now. You do the math, it's 2024. And so we've been there ever since. And Ratio Christi was a very young ministry then, just starting. There wasn't a lot of infrastructure, a lot of leadership. And so it took a number of years for Ratio Christi kind of get more, balanced and stable. And now they've got really good leadership, so it's in a good spot. But I was there in the very, very early years. So anyway, but so we've been there for a long time. Yeah.
Now, did that ministry of Ratio Christi, did that help spark the interest in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah?
Well, what sparked that was I came to faith in my mid-20s. I was raised in a nominal Methodist church growing up. I was not truly a believer, not against Jesus, just didn't know what the gospel was.
Sure.
And when I started seeking, really asking where I was right, if I was right with God, a friend of mine told me about a congregation in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, and it's a local Messianic congregation. Messianic congregations have Jews who believe. These are Jews who believe, not really anything new. I mean, the first century, they were Jews who believe, but I'd never heard of such a thing. But I had grown up in a Jewish community. Growing up, I grew up around a lot of Jewish people. A lot of my friends were Jewish, but they weren't really religious. And I was not Jewish, but still, I just had so many Jewish friends. And so I wandered in this congregation with Jews who actually believed in Jesus. I never heard of such a thing. I mean, I was biblically illiterate. And I just heard the gospel there. It was preached, from the pulpit. And then I came to know the Lord. And right away, God put it on my heart to reach Jewish people. I always had a heart for them. And so just got very involved in like theology, dealing with, Israel and Jewish messianism. Is Jesus a Messiah? Because I was interacting with some Jewish missionaries who didn't believe he's a Messiah. So it always been on my mind. And so, but what got me was my interest in the resurrection had always been there for a long time. But I was thinking about it when I talked to Jewish people about whether he was a Messiah, and a lot of them didn't really give a lot of stock to the resurrection. And so I was thinking like, well, if I study harder in Jewish history or like Jewish messianic expectations, I wonder if there even is an expectation that the Messiah is supposed to rise from the dead. And the more I got into it, the more I realized there really wasn't any really clear messianic expectation, the history of Jewish thought that the Mashiach, the Messiah, when he comes, would rise from the dead. So I kind of put those two and two together, and it just bothered me for a while. And I'd had a lot of thoughts on it for years. I wrote a book. There's a book on Amazon I wrote called The Resurrection of the Jewish Messiah, like is a longer version of this argument. And it's just something that bothered me for a long time. And so I finally kind of just took some of that material. Then I kind of came up with some new ideas and synthesized that for the book we dedicated to Frank. So it's something I've been working on for a long time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. So I want to revisit that idea that was there this clear expectation, but before we do that, just for the sake of our listeners, can we talk briefly about what it means when we say Messiah? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's, the Messiah just means anointed one. And, we say in Judaism, like the Mashiach. In Greek, of course, it's Christos, how it's translated. And, various people were anointed throughout the Old Testament. It's very clear that, David could be anointed by the Holy Spirit to, like, God would come upon him through the Spirit to accomplish a task. Or a priest could be anointed with oil. A prophet could be anointed with oil. Just to fulfill a specific task for God. Even Cyrus, we know, is called like an anointed one, anointed figure. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a Jewish person, obviously, because Cyrus was anointed. Then you have the one, the Daniel 9 passage, talks about the anointed one. So it just means somebody that was consecrated to do something for God. They're like anointed by God, empowered, or else consecrated to fulfill a specific task for God.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then when Christians say Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and you're saying that they were called to a specific task, right? So what task would a Christian say would be, again, just for the sake of our listeners to kind of lay the foundation or the groundwork, what would in what way is Jesus specifically a Messiah?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think what you see in the Old Testament are the figures that are anointed to do things are generally fall into 3 categories: prophets, priests, and kings. That's generally the ones that they're anointed to do things. And so Jesus, when he comes, okay, so you could take like King David, you could say that he's like a son of God in a way, like he's a king, for God's purposes. He's a son of God. God's the king, and Israel's the people. God's the king over Israel and the land. And then David's like a kingly figure, right? And so then you might have another figure that's a priest or a prophet. But the point is that when Jesus comes, he's anointed as a prophet, priest, and king to fulfill all 3 of those roles. Only he is not just like an earthly king like David. He has a special relationship with God like David, but he is not a son of God, but like the son of God. He's like the big one, the big son of God. Or we could say David's like a little Messiah in a way, but he's not the Messiah. You know what I mean? And just like you had other priests or prophets doing things in the Old Testament, Jesus is the prophet, the ultimate prophet, and the ultimate priest in the order of Melchizedek. So he's anointed to fulfill all 3 of those roles for sure. And then he fulfills those through he's consecrated. His messianic task starts at his baptism. When he comes out of the water with John the Baptist, he starts his messianic ministry. And then he fulfills those roles through his miracles, through his actions, and then ultimately, of course, through dying and rising from the dead. Yes. And so, that's the thing. But there is some disconnect, as I said, between, you look at those figures in the Old Testament, none of them really are rising from the dead or dying for the sins of humanity or atoning for sin necessarily, but they do other things. I mean, they do, similar. Jesus has similarities with them, but Jesus just does something even more as the Messiah who fulfills the Old Testament scriptures.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And again, forgive me if that seems elementary. It's just, when I was reading your essay, I thought you did a great job of explaining what we mean when we say Jesus is Messiah. And it got me thinking, I wonder if that's something Christians sitting in the pews, like they hear that over and over again. But if you actually ask them, okay, what's that mean? Would they be able to articulate that? And so I thought it was important just for you to lay that out for us.
That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I love that. So you talked a bit about those first century messianic expectations that Jews had. And I thought, honestly, that was one of the most fascinating parts of your essay for me. What did you learn about these expectations when you did that deep dive you talked about? And were these expectations uniform? Were they different? Were they all over the map? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, when I started to interact with some of the Jewish, we call them anti-missionaries. They have like groups like Jews for Judaism, Jewish Outreach. And they have their own apologetics. They have everything. And so I just began to realize that, they just simply don't have, don't seem to have the same messianic expectations we have. The most traditional messianic expectation, which was put forth by Maimonides, who is a great Jewish thinker, the medieval period. He's influenced the Jewish world forever. He combined like philosophy and theology together. He was just a brilliant guy. But, his view has kind of been the standard traditional view for a lot of Jews. And that is that when the Messiah comes, he's not divine. He's simply an earthly king who's definitely anointed by God, but he's not divine, and he will reign in Israel. He will gather all the Jewish people there. They will live in more of like a restored Israel where everything is good. It's peaceful. Jerusalem's at the center of the earth. They're not being, marked out to be killed and all this war and stuff. And he reigns from there, and he kind of gathers the Jewish people back to the land. There's like a gathering of all the Jews back to the land. And so he really provides some sort of order in Israel, but there's no Messianic expectation there, generally the traditional view that he's any kind of divine figure. Okay. And so that's what most Jews believe, or else you can have what's called we call it the Messianic age view. The Messianic age is where they believe one day, like when you read in the Old Testament, some of these passages like the lion will lie down with the lamb and all this peace on earth, these world changes where there's just peace. Everything, the world looks differently. Some Jews say that when the Messianic age comes, the Messiah will be there in the midst of that. So you see a change in world conditions, which kind of, in my opinion, looks supernatural to me biblically. They look kind of supernatural to me, and I don't know how an earthly Messiah could pull that off. But the point is that they don't really, like one guy said to me, it's like, if the Messiah comes, I'll just know he's here. I'll just look at the world. The world's going to look different. That's the way they believe in some sort of peace, some sort of restoration. And that's why with Christians today, when we talk about the future of Israel, some people believe, like Romans 11 teaches, a future conversion of Israel, like a future salvation of Israel, of a group of Jews. Then other people believe not only that, they believe in the restoration of Israel. So some Christians believe there's a future for Israel as a people, not only to be saved through the Messiah, but also to be restored to the land. And the land's different. And all those Old Testament passages that talk about what Jews believe the Messiah was supposed to do, well, we believe will happen at the second coming. And so a lot of those things will happen. They'll just happen at the second coming, like all these restoration passages you see throughout the Old Testament. Then some Christians don't believe that at all, obviously.
Right.
They say, yeah, Jesus comes back, and there's no special plan for Israel, and Israel, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, where's he coming to?
Right.
Is he coming to California, or is he coming to Ohio? I can't get my friends that are totally don't believe that. I'm like, well, where does he come to? Like, there has to be a land there for him to come to, right? I'm like, anyway,
it does make sense.
That's a whole other story,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it'll be Hagerstown or Ohio. I mean, I don't know,
right?
Or
Chicago, maybe Chicago or New York.
Exactly. So I guess I'm thinking here before you kind of start, diving into your case a little bit.
Also, I left something out, but go ahead.
Yeah.
When I talked about the traditional view, that's the main view. But when you look at Jewish Messianic expectations throughout history, if you take the whole wide scope, I'm talking about throughout first century, the time of Jesus, and otherwise, there are other Messianic expectations. Like there's at the time of Jesus, it's obvious that it was very varied. Like they're looking for a prophetic Messiah. They say, are you the prophet? In the book of John, they're looking for a Son of Man kind of expectation.
Mm-hmm.
The Son of Man kind of thing has come to fore focus in scholarship. Like, hey, there's some Jews that believe when the Messiah comes, he's like the Son of Man. I mean, Son of Man's like a Messianic title. So kind of that expectation. And then there's like now we found out that the Dead Sea Scrolls, we read the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran discoveries. It seems like they were expecting a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah. And a prophetic Messiah. So, it seems to me from what I've studied, it's just not one dominant Messianic expectation at the time of Jesus. Everybody thinks, oh, Jesus, they wanted him to come and take over Rome, set up his kingdom. Yeah, that's there, but there's also some other Messianic expectations too, I think. So we don't want to be too narrow there, Yeah. So, yeah.
So when you're in conversation with people and particularly Jewish people, do they find will they sometimes challenge you and ask something I could easily see them asking something like, well, why didn't God make it more clear? Why didn't God make that Jesus was the Messiah more obvious?
I haven't heard that one too much because most of the Jews, that's a struggle from where Christians, I think, you struggle with the prophecy. Sometimes the Old Testament, they seem a little vague some places. Like Michael Heiser has a clip called why is prophecy unclear? He did a whole clip on that, why prophecy seems unclear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the times it seems a little cryptic in the Old Testament. Some of the Messianic prophecies, I mean, we think they're clear, like, traditional apologetics, like, yeah, there's 330 Messianic expectations, they're all fulfilled in Jesus, or so clear. But, the more you look at those clear, I don't think there's 330. I think there's more like Michael Brown says, maybe like 30 to 40 really good ones.
Yeah.
And you have to really go into deeper and do the exegesis and figure out, is this really a Messianic prophecy? I think that traditional apologetics has done that a little superficially. I think we need to kind of like be a little better at that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that what we would want to say is that we're talking to Jewish people. I don't run into that too much because most of the Jews that we interact with at Ohio State, since that's what we do in most of our campus outreach, or most of our outreach, they're generally secular. And so they don't really think much about the Messiah.
I see.
The Jews we deal with today are mostly agnostic or atheists, so talking about whether Jesus is the Messiah, then it's kind of like, I don't know if I don't really necessarily believe in a God.
Right.
So, you have to establish like a God exists.
Interesting.
And, first of all with them that he's a real God. And then you can bring the Messiah into it, but a lot of them are just so secular, meaning they're culturally Jewish. They practice Judaism as a culture, and it's very important to them as their identity.
Mm-hmm.
But they just simply don't have any strong convictions about the Old Testament. They've probably never read it, or even God. And so some of the people we're dealing with are in that category. Now, the ones we do deal with every once in a while will just simply say, "Oh, Jesus isn't Messiah. I just, I'm Jewish and he's not for us." And then if you get a really hardcore like Orthodox, then you're going to get into, well, he's not the Messiah because, he didn't fulfill the Messianic expectations. He didn't set up the kingdom. The world is still in a bad place. Israel's in a bad place. And mostly in Jewish thought and orthodoxy, the Messiah will only come when Israel's ready to receive him. So there isn't like this thing, he just shows up. It's like Israel has to be willing to receive their Messiah. And so a lot of Orthodox Jews today think that most of Jewish people in the world are not living any remotely Torah-driven life. They're not following the law or the Torah or anything. They're just secular. So they're saying the Messiah is not going to come because they're not living righteously before God. They're not practicing anything. They're just secular. And so when Jesus says, "Blessed is he," you won't see me again until blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, like in the Matthew 22 text, I think. It's kind of a similar theme. He's like, I don't come back until you receive me, you welcome me. See what I mean? So that kind of theme is also in Orthodoxy with Jewish Messianism. So they just don't, that's part of the issue. It's kind of depends on Israel's repentance in a way.
Wow. So,
Israel needs to repent.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you correctly, then when you're in a conversation with what we would call a secular Jewish person, you almost, before you can even start to argue that the resurrection proves that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, you've got to establish that a God exists, and you've got to establish that a resurrection even happened. Is that correct?
Exactly. Now, I did have one Jewish person say to me once, this was a long time ago. He said, "I don't care if Jesus rose from the dead 14 times. It doesn't mean he's the Messiah." And so I was just kind of like, what? And so, but the time, this is like probably 15 years ago. At the time I was like, that's really weird. But then I began to, that's kind of got me going in this deep dive. I said, oh, well, that's because in Jewish thinking, they just don't have like a resurrection Messianic expectation. It's just not there really. So I could see where he's coming from. I mean, like now it doesn't make any sense to us.
Sure.
But to him, I could see why he's saying that.
Yeah. So, so that's actually leads into giving you a great opportunity to begin to make your case. And so I'm going to ask it this way. So one of the points you make in your essay is that the Old Testament doesn't have as an expectation for the Messiah a resurrection. Is that correct?
Yeah, what I say in the article or the chapter, the article I wrote there, that contribution, I say that there's no explicit text anywhere that teaches that the Messiah, when he comes, will rise from the dead. I don't see it. You could argue maybe a couple implicit texts implicitly. You could say like at the end of Isaiah 53, the servant, he's vindicated, and God shows him prosperity, or the thing with his offspring, there's something there like, There's an implicit part in Isaiah 53, I'd say, at the end. Of course, Jews don't think Isaiah 53 is about Jesus generally.
Right.
That's the traditional view. And then you have like a Psalm 16 passage, which is like a typology that Peter quotes in Acts 2. That David, I won't let your Holy One see decay, and that's supposed to be about maybe David originally, but then it's like a points to Jesus after that. So maybe there's like a couple things there, those two. But what I say in the book, even if there isn't anything explicit, well, no, I don't say this actually in the article. I didn't have time to write this in, but I'll add this in here. This is what I say in my book. I would say, even though you don't see anything explicitly, what you do see is that in order for the Messiah to fulfill the role of a prophet, priest, and king, he has to rise from the dead. Okay, because what I mean by that, to be a prophet like Moses, you've got to do miracles. Jesus said the ultimate miracle will be my rising from the dead. He says that in Matthew 12. The ultimate sign will be when I rise from the dead. So you have to do miracles like Moses. The second thing, to be a priest forever and ever and ever, and you never die, not like the earthly priest, is you have to be able to live forever and be a priest forever. So the resurrection fixes that problem, to be in the order of Melchizedek. And then to be a king, to be a Davidic king forever, like Paul says in Romans 1, the first 5 verses, he says, Jesus is a son of God, descendant of David, resurrected from the dead. To be on the throne of David forever, to fulfill the Davidic covenant, to keep that covenant going permanently without an earthly king, you have to rise from the dead. So I'd say his resurrection helps fulfill those 3 roles, prophet, priest, and king, completely. Okay, it just doesn't say that in the Old Testament. When the Messiah comes, he's going to fulfill the roles of priest, he's going to rise from the dead, or fulfill the roles of king, for he's going to rise from the dead. It just doesn't say that explicitly. But I'd say that's what we could infer, and I think that makes sense.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So let's imagine that you're in a conversation and you are attempting to make a case of this idea that the resurrection proves that Jesus is a Jewish Messiah. What does that sound like? Where do you start?
Well, I would say that, first of all, if I'm talking to a Jewish person, I would say, do you understand how important it is, why we think Jesus is the Messiah, why he rose from the dead, like why these two are connected? And I said, let me go to the Old Testament. Well, first of all, I'm going to talk about the end of Deuteronomy 29 and 30, chapters 29 and 30, where God tells Moses, he says to him, I've not given you eyes to see or ears to hear yet. I'm going to circumcise your heart, though, one day. I'm going to do something different than what is in the law you've been given in the Torah. So he kind of gives Moses a prophetic clue that something's coming greater, something where God's going to circumcise their heart. He's going to open their eyes, open their ears. And so then I would, if I'm with a Jew, which I did this with a Jew, by the way, then I turn to Jeremiah 31. And I talk about the new covenant passages where Jesus, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were split. And God says, I'm going to unite you under one covenant. And I'm going to write the law in your hearts. And I'm going to, give you, a way to know me directly. And the Holy Spirit's going to come. So then I point into that and I said, so how do you think this is fulfilled? Like how does this happen? Like these things, like where God told Moses, this is going to happen. Then in Jeremiah 31, this is going to happen. How does that even happen? And then I might take him to Ezekiel 36, where it talks about the Jews are being restored to the land, and God says, I'll sprinkle clean water on you. I'll put a new spirit within you. Similar passages about the new covenant. And I'll say this. Then I take him to John 3. If they're open, I'll take him to John 3, where Jesus talks about being born again. And I'll say, do you understand that the only way this happens is the work of the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, comes into your life, and the law of God's written on your heart. The Holy Spirit comes in you, empowers you to live out God's ways, and so that can only happen if Jesus rises from the dead, because he sends the Spirit after he rises from the dead to fulfill those texts in Deuteronomy and Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. So I say that's not going to happen unless a Messiah rises from the dead. So I kind of try to connect those together. And then I also say, as I say in the book, now the book you're reading, or the chapter you read in mine, I also talk about how Israel's calling is to be a light to the whole world. They're supposed to be, a testimony to the nations. There's people are supposed to look to Israel like, you got the one true God. Let me out of my polytheism and paganism. I want to come to the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I talk about how the Abrahamic covenant promised that in Abraham's seed, the nations will be blessed. And then I talk about how Jesus is from the seed of Abraham. And I talk about how through his ministry, Only the Jewish person in the history of Jewish thought or Jewish history that has helped 1.4 billion non-Jews come to know the one true God. Okay, he has spread that, like Jews say, the Messiah is supposed to spread the knowledge of God across the world. Well, Jesus has spread the knowledge of God throughout the nations of the one true God. And he's done that only through his death and resurrection. It has to be him rising from the dead. Because if he had died, realistically, I mean, he would have just been considered another, Jewish failed Messiah, and most of his followers would not have followed him. There would have been no birth of our faith at all. It would have just died out. Because they had a lot of those guys back then, not a lot, but some that would happen, as I mentioned in the chapter.
Yes.
They led a revolt, and then they got squashed by the Romans, they got killed or something. Even though Jesus didn't even lead a revolt, they'd still say, well, he's dead, he's done, we'll move on to the next guy. But the point is that through his resurrection, the knowledge of God has gone out, and all these other people groups, non-Jews outside of Israel, can come to know the one true God. I don't think that's going to happen. A Jewish guy shows up in Israel, is rejected by the majority of his people. He's called to Israel to be their Messiah. And just so happens that through his death and resurrection, especially his resurrection, all these non-Jews, the Gentiles, the pagans, get to believe.
Yeah.
We get grafted into the covenant, like Paul says in Romans 11. So I say that's not going to be possible. So what I tell a Jew, I'm like, do you understand that Israel's calling is to be a light to the world? They're supposed to spread the knowledge of God. Do you understand that Jesus has done that through his ministry? He's the only guy that's done that. I'm a benefit of that. And so I kind of take him to Isaiah 49, maybe talks about the servant of the Lord will be a light to the nations as well. So yeah, I kind of take it down those roads, a couple of those areas there. That's what I tried to do. The one guy, the first part I told you about with the Deuteronomy passages in Jeremiah 31, I did that with a Jewish student once. I was sitting in the Panera on campus, and he ran back to his Orthodox friend. And man, his Orthodox friend was so mad. He was like, you're trying to convert Lee to Christianity and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, listen, he didn't know any of his scriptures. Like, I'm going over passages in the Old Testament. Like, he just didn't know. He'd never seen any of them.
Wow.
You know what I mean? So
yeah,
they just don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So with that case, what are some of the common objections that you get? What is, some of those pushbacks that you can almost detect are coming?
Well, I think for Jewish people, Jewish identity is marked by generally three things, at least two or three things. One, a commitment to self-preservation of the Jewish people. Like you want to exist, because they've almost been wiped out so many times, as they are trying to be wiped out to this day. Another thing is the existence of Israel, like a place, a land. That's all Zionism means. It just means self-existence, the desire to have Jewish people exist and have a homeland to live in. That's all it really means. That's all Zionism is, and from a practical, basic understanding. So I think that that's part of Jewish identity. I mean, not all Jews are Zionists, I know, but most of them believe in Israel's existence, the right to exist, to have a land to live in. And one of the third marker, and Holocaust, identification with what happened in the Holocaust, like you're aware of what happened in the Holocaust. You're not ignorant about that, because it could happen again. And fourth, non-belief in Jesus is a huge Jewish identity marker. So most Jews just are so part of their identity is not to believe in Jesus. They've just been taught that from a very early age, and so they just don't really consider Jesus like even an option. He's not like on their radar screen. Now, it is true today, there are way more Jews who believe than there used to be. There's a lot of Messianic congregations. There's a lot more Jews who are more open about their faith, who believe, they're more prolific. So there's a lot more than there used to be. Certainly Israel has about, I think, how many Jews I went to Israel, maybe like 10 million Jews, 11 million Jews living there. And I think like maybe, a very small percentage of them believe in Jesus in Israel, but worldwide, there's a decent amount of Jews who believe in Jesus, but there's still the majority don't.
Right.
The majority don't. And Paul talks about that in Romans 11. He says there's a partial hardening on Israel. So, that's just scriptural.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They're not all going to believe.
Yeah. And when you say they don't believe in Jesus, like most of them, I'm guessing, believe in Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure. What we're talking about is they're not trusting in Jesus, right?
Right. They're not trusting him as a Messiah, nor do they, as I said before, they really care. I mean, because if they're secular, they don't care. Now, I try to walk them through the high holiday cycle that if you're going through Passover or Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the fall holidays, when they focus on atonement, I try to always point them to say, listen, we just believe Jesus is like our atonement. That's how we have full atonement for sins. He's our atonement. And he's our Passover lamb. Your Passover Seder meal points to Jesus. And, the blood of the door on the lamb, that God told them come in to do, that's our covering. Jesus covers us. So I always tie it within that. And that seems to click with them a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, oh, okay, I never thought of that. I never thought about that's what you believe about Jesus.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But, when I was promoting a Michael Brown event at Ohio State years ago called Is Jesus the Jewish Messiah? Michael and I came up with that title. Handing out the flyers for that were interesting because you had Jews that came by. They're like, wait, what do you mean? I'm confused. Jewish Messiah. Like, he's not our Messiah, the ones that were interested. And then the Christians were the ones that were confused. The Christians came by and they're like, what are you talking about? He's not, what do you mean Jewish Messiah? They thought he's the Christian Messiah, and so I was just like, okay, let me explain.
Right.
Let me explain this to you, But I mean, they were confused. One girl walked by and goes, no, and I'm Christian. I'm like, well, I am too, but let me explain.
Oh, dear.
So that's 2,000 years of Jewish history mixed in with Christianity, all the barriers that have come and gone, the misunderstandings, right? The stereotypes.
Yeah.
So you got to work through those.
So my hunch in starting with defining Messiah sounds like it was pretty good then, if I don't mind saying myself.
I think Jewish people haven't really thought deeply what the Messiah is supposed to do. I mean, they've been told Jesus isn't the Messiah. They're not sure why, but you know what I mean? But all they know, he's another failed guy, there's been several Messiahs in our people's history, just failed like another one.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But a lot of them just haven't looked into it deeply. But some of them are open, some of them are open to talk. And, we've had some good conversations with them. It's not like everybody's like totally closed off. It just depends on who you talk to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, Eric, in your conversations on this topic, how important are evidential concerns as in regard to specifically the resurrection? Meaning, do people push back and say, well, that didn't happen? And then you're able to marshal some of the historical evidences, or does that not really enter the conversation too much? It's not of high importance to them, I mean.
You mean with Jewish people or just people in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm specifically because of our topic, speaking mainly of Jewish people. But I mean, if you wanted to speak to the broader experience you've had too with Ratio Christi there on the college campus, that would be fine as well.
Well, I think with Jewish people, if you look at groups like Jews for Judaism and those outreach Judaism, like those anti-missionary groups, they will typically appeal to all the main liberal arguments we have against the New Testament, traditional arguments against the New Testament, which most of apologetics has dealt with throughout the decades and decades. Put out answers. We don't rewrite the Gospels. They're written too late. They're legendary.
Right.
Blah 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 blah. Arguments against the historicity of the New Testament. Those groups do that. Now, if you're talking to just a regular secular Jewish person, then they might ask for evidence, but overall, like I said, I just think half the time I'm just trying to get them to consider the God question, whether there's a God, he's real, get him out of agnostic land. But they don't know enough about the New Testament to really say much about against it. You know what I mean? It's only if you run into a hardcore, well-studied person that's looked into it. But I would say for sure, Jews have been impacted by. They've all been impacted by the worldviews of materialism, naturalism, all that kind of stuff that we deal with in apologetics. They've been impacted by, all the higher criticism of the Bible, stuff like that. They've all been evolutionary thought, everything. So you kind of have to work through those worldview issues with them a lot of the time. But I'd say on a general level, students in the resurrection, they might bring up objections about the New Testament evidence. Like, I don't know how a guy rose from the dead. How do you know? We weren't there, and then I have to go through the basics of how we do history and how we know something historically happened and stuff like that. So you run into some of those people. And then some people have, of course, the miracle objection. I just can't believe a guy rose from the dead. You'll have some of those people. But, overall, I tell you, like I've told people, the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen more openness to the things of God on campus. I've seen way more openness there used to be. There's a lot. It's not all atheists and agnostics. I mean, there's plenty of people that are asking deep questions, thinking about big questions. So, yeah, I think overall we're in a pretty good place compared to what it used to be. Now, we were there in the period of the new atheism, 2008 to 2013 or 14, where all those atheism books are being written. And then we had to deal with the atheist group on campus. There's certainly a hard atheism on campus that was definitely there, but I'd say it's kind of mellowed out.
Yes.
Compared to what it used to be. It's nowhere what it used to be.
Yeah.
Back in that phase, all the apologists were responding to that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we've kind of moved on. I just get the feeling the campus is not at our campus. Now, I can't speak for every campus.
Sure.
But our campus is not what it was back then. For a while, I was like, God, how many atheists am I going to talk to? I'm getting tired of talking to atheists. And then finally, it seems like, oh, okay. There's hope over the mountain, looking over the mountainside. So it's better now than it was.
And now even atheists don't want to talk about the new atheists. So.
Right. And the atheist group at Ohio State is actually gone. They kind of just don't have any leadership, and they just kind of fizzled out.
Oh, wow.
So they're not even there anymore. I don't even have an atheist group to talk to, a secular group. They're not even here.
Interesting.
So it's kind of strange. Yeah, I was there for a while. Yeah.
So one thing you mentioned that, and I know you don't deal directly with it, but obviously you're equipped to, and I think it would be helpful because I know I've heard it a good bit, and I don't even get in as many conversations with Jewish folks as you do, is this idea that when Christians will say that Isaiah 53 is about Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. One of a very common Jewish objection is no, that's about Israel, right? Mm-hmm. So what are 2 or 3 things that the Christian can say to kind of challenge that assertion and maybe get somebody thinking in a different direction?
Well, I think that what we need to tell them is that in the history of Jewish thought, they haven't always believed it's been about Israel. Okay, that was a reaction from Rashi, one of the great Jewish rabbis in Jewish thought that kind of reacted to the Christian view of it being about Jesus. And he kind of turned around and said, no, it's about Israel. Now, they're right that in Isaiah 40 to 55, chapters, you will see times the servant of the Lord is Israel. It's true. Mm-hmm. There's times, but then it switches specifically to an individual. It will switch after, I think, like Isaiah, I can't remember, it's a chapter like maybe 42 on, you'll see it referring a lot of times to an individual, not to Israel. So it kind of alternates back and forth sometimes. But so they can't argue with us that the servant's always about Israel, because it's not. Okay, you can't always say that. But I think that if you go through the exegesis on Isaiah 52:13, starting Isaiah 52:13 to Isaiah 53:12, I think it's going to be really hard to make Israel fit in that context, to fulfill certain things that happen there, being pierced through for our transgressions, atoning for sin, being blameless, all those things. And then what I always do also is I wrote in a little book called Is Jesus the Jewish Messiah? In another little book, it's on Amazon. But I talk about how later on after Jesus, it's interesting that the rabbis came up with this issue of trying to figure out how we deal with the passages in the Old Testament to talk about the suffering and rejected portions of a figure. Looks like he's going to be suffering, he's going to be rejected, he's going to be similar to what Zechariah talks about, the pierced passages of Zechariah and Isaiah 53. So they said, how do we reconcile this rejected Messiah figure with a kingly Messiah? And then they wrote in the Talmud that they said, okay, which came after Jesus, the Talmud, they said, well, if the Messiah comes and Israel's worthy, the Messiah will come in the clouds like Daniel 7 says. He'll come in the clouds. But if he's not worthy, he'll come riding on a donkey. And so they began to wrestle with Zechariah 9 and some of these other passages that seem to offer a dual Messiah perspective, that he can be a suffering, rejected Messiah and a kingly Messiah. That there seems to be 2 roles there, which we believe are all fulfilled in Jesus, one guy.
Right.
And then the other thing is, if you read the Jewish literature after Jesus, like you go through the rabbinical readings, the rabbinical writings, the Talmud, the Zohar, which is a Jewish prayer book, and the Mishnah, all this, these Jewish writings, some of them say they'll read Isaiah 53 and say it's about the Messiah. Like, it's not about Israel. Like, it's clearly about the Messiah. It's about a messianic figure who makes atonement. They just don't say it's the only issues. They don't say it's Jesus, but it's very clear in the rabbinical writings after Jesus left that there are passages that say Isaiah 53 is about a Messiah. It's about a figure. It's not about Israel, And so, because in Jewish thought, people make atonement for sin, like Moses offers himself as atonement for Israel. I mean, rabbis, holy righteous men say, I can offer myself as an atonement. So it's just not really foreign to Jewish thought to have someone, a righteous person, atone for sin. It's totally in the Jewish literature. It's there. It's not a Christian invention that a righteous figure can atone for the sins of the generation, or of Israel.
Yeah.
So, I always just show them passages in their own literature after Jesus that show that Isaiah 53 is about a messianic figure. Even if you don't think it's Jesus, like, hey, it's in your literature. You can't say Christians are way off.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we didn't invent this.
Right.
You know what I mean? So,
yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. That's helpful.
Yeah.
I always like to.
And that's in that little booklet. Yeah.
I always think about it from the perspective, I'm sure you've heard this from Greg Kogle about, how can you put a stone in somebody's shoe? Right. And so I doubt that I'm going to be in a conversation with a Jewish person and I'm going to convince them in one conversation that Isaiah 53 is about Jesus. But I would like to leave, like I said, put a stone in their shoe and get them thinking. So that's helpful.
So that's another little book I wrote, even though we changed the cover because it looked god awful with the Catholic Jesus on there. So we have a section on the end about the Jewish writings that talk about an atoning Messiah.
Okay.
So that's only 46 pages. Yeah, I hand those to students sometimes.
Excellent.
Like the Jewish students, if they're interested.
Sure.
With the new cover.
Yes, with the new cover.
So,
yes.
Right.
Not the Catholic Jesus cover. Right.
Right. I mean, I'm not against Calvin. I just say I want Jesus to look somewhat Semitic. But anyway,
exactly. Yeah. You don't want him to look. Yeah, exactly. So
we don't want the Gentile looking Jesus yet.
So I was wondering, as I was reading your chapter, I thought about an objection that I heard from Michael Shermer, and I believe it might have been in a debate with Dr. Turek during the Q&A or the cross or something, but don't quote me on that.
I know they debated, yeah.
Yeah, and it was something along these lines, and I know you've spoken to this in passing during the interview, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of, before we land the plane here. He says something along these lines. If the case for Jesus's messiahship is so compelling, why are there so many Jewish people today that are still waiting on the Messiah? Why aren't they convinced? And of course, that's Shermer's objection, not my own.
Yeah, well, I don't really, if I had been there, and I don't know how Frank answered it because I didn't see it. But for one thing, I would say, well, Michael, a lot of Jewish people don't really think about it. They haven't really thought about it. So I think you're assuming they're so unconvinced or they care. I would tell Michael, like, so much of the Jewish community, even you can show statistically, they've shown Pew surveys are just not religious. And so some of them just don't care, Michael. So you're making an assumption that all of them are sitting around going, oh, the case for Jesus' messiahship is so weak. And, oh, man, I'm so just not convinced at all.
Wow.
A lot of them haven't even looked into it. That's the first thing I would say to Michael if I was responding. Secondly, I would say to Michael that, there isn't really one messianic expectation in Judaism. It isn't so cut and dry. And so it's more complicated than you think. And thirdly, I'm not sure that if they have looked into it, that they really, I kind of would push back on those two issues, like his assumption that so many Jews are not convinced by the messiahship of Jesus so convincing. Oh, no. Thirdly, I would say this to say, Michael, the history of Christianity and Judaism is really messy, of course. You have a lot of anti-Semitism. You've had a lot of problems historically. And most of Judaism today, or it has been always a reaction to Christianity. They've reacted because out of trying to survive, even the Nazis use Christian symbolism, they perverted it. And they tried to make Jesus into an Aryan Jesus. And so I just say a lot of Jews have just reacted so strongly against even considering Jesus on the table for anything. They don't even, it's just because they're history, you know? So I don't even know how many of them have deeply looked into it, Michael. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
You know, that would be my view.
Yeah, that's a great point because he's kind of begging the question there, isn't he? Which I didn't see that until you mentioned it. He's assuming that all these Jewish people have sat down and said, oh, okay, I want to look at the theological and historical case for Jesus being Messiah, and then I'm going to judge it on its own merits, where you're saying that there's a lot more to it, and it's a lot more complicated than that.
Or they haven't even really considered it. Like I said, they just haven't even considered it. I mean, you know, are they going to go read? I mean, some of them might pick up Michael Brown's volume 1 through 5, Answering Jewish Objections. You know, he's got that massive 5-volume set. Some of them may go pursue that. But, you know, no, I'd also say to Michael, I'd say, if you want to know what the objections are, Michael Brown wrote a 5-volume set. You can see historically and all the theology and all the issues. It's way more complicated. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, I'd also say to Michael, you know, there were a lot of Jews that believed in Jesus in the first century, probably about 3,000, we think, estimate 3,000 to 4,000.
That's a good point.
Now, no, that's not all Israel, but truth isn't determined by majority, Michael, as you know. Yeah. You know that, Michael, as a big skeptic guy, you know that, right?
That's good.
So I might mention that too.
Yeah. Well, and what you're saying, I saw confirmed. You mentioned Dr. Brown in preparation for the interview with you. I because I wanted to be a little bit more knowledgeable of a Jewish perspective on Jesus's messiahship. There was a debate that Dr. Brown did with a Rabbi Freitag. And essentially,
I saw that.
Yeah, and essentially in his opening statement, I mean, he basically says, like, this isn't even worth us Jews looking into. You know, that you know, he basically he doesn't use the term fairy tale, but the way he talks about it is almost like this is just ridiculous. There's nothing here. And so that kind of supports what you're saying, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, was that the one debate from Unbelievable? He did, the guy, he was in England, I think. The rabbi was in England, I think.
No, I watched that one as well. That guy was like a progressive Jew. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, well, Reform Jews, they're called Reform Judaism. That's a synagogue. You can go to like a Reform synagogue. They're the most liberal Jews. Yes. They're kind of like almost humanistic Jews in a way.
And that one I watched as well. And I'll be honest with you, I don't want to get too off topic, but that one was the only one I watched. The Freitag one, I watched the one you mentioned on Unbelievable. And then I watched, I can't remember how to say his last name. Shmuley.
Bateo.
I always want to say Bateo. That's Bateo.
I could be.
Okay. Yeah. So the one with the Reformed Jewish gentleman was the only one that I actually found really frustrating. Yeah.
I do remember the Freitag one that took place, I think, in North Carolina, or down Kenosha, or in Georgia.
Yeah.
It took place down there at our Ratio Christi chapter.
Yeah.
I think down there.
Yeah, and they referenced that something happened with scheduling where Rabbi Freitag only had like 2 or 3 days to prepare or something. So I'm not sure what happened there, but yeah. So, but anyway, just kind of to sum that up, that his attitude toward this idea of Jesus being Messiah is just echoes what you were saying. You know, about some of the attitudes toward it. Yeah.
They're just trying to survive, really. They're just like, hey, we just want to have a culture of people and we just want to be left alone. And just try to survive in this world. Yeah. I mean, which it has gotten worse over the last year, as we see. I mean,
no doubt.
It's obvious that they have a lot of issues, you know what I mean? And so they may not be thinking a lot about this, you know?
Yeah.
So,
and I was glad to hear in Rabbi Shmuley's debate with Dr. Brown, he did say that evangelicals are their greatest allies. So I was very heartened that he was willing to admit that, even with his
better than the Muslims
disagreements. Yeah.
Right.
So as we are, first of all, thank you so much for your time and for your work. And it's been so great chatting with you. But if somebody's listening and you've offered some resources of your own, what are some other resources that you would say, hey, if you really want to dig into this idea of the resurrection proving that Jesus is the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, or just that Jesus is a Jewish Messiah, where would you point them to?
I would say certainly if you go to my blog, thinkapologetics.com, I've got my books listed there. and you can get my resurrection book. Is it's called is does the resurrection prove Jesus is the Jewish Messiah? It's on the website there, and I've got my other little booklets here. Is Jesus is Yeshua the Jewish Messiah? So you might get something out of that, and then also if you want to go like deeper. I have like book recommendations on my blog. Like I have I remember one blog post I had on Messianic prophecy readings, Jewish Messianism. But honestly, there hasn't been a whole lot written about the connection between Jesus's resurrection and his messiahship. Now, there is a book by a friend of mine named David Mishkin. He wrote a book. He's Jewish and he's a believer. He wrote a book about 6, 7 years ago, which Ben Shaw and Gary Habermas actually reviewed. And I think it's called Jesus' Messiahship from a Jewish Perspective, or Jesus' Resurrection from a Jewish Perspective. I think that's what it is, something to do with resurrection.
Okay.
But that's a good book.
Okay.
To get that, just look up David Mishkin on Amazon. I think it's Miskin or Miskhan. I think that's what his name is. Just look up that. So that's one of the few resources that's out there. But Michael Brown's book, Michael has a book out on the resurrection. He had a book come out like 3 years ago on something to do with the resurrection. He talked about a rabbi in New York named Schneerson, who's followed by a lot of Jews today who think that he's a Messiah, and they think he's coming back, and they think that there's some sort of resurrection thing with him.
Wow.
Some sort of resurrection thing with him. Yeah, his posters are all over Israel. He's like very well known in the Hasidic community. But look up Michael Brown on Amazon. Look up Michael Brown Resurrection. He wrote a book on something about it like 3 years ago. I reviewed it. I can't remember the title. I have it on my shelf. So Michael's written a book on that.
Okay.
That might be a good resource too.
Okay.
Something along those lines. Yeah.
All right.
All
right. Eric Chabot, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
All right, Chad. Thank you. Good seeing you. Keep up the good work at Truth Bomb. I'm glad it's not called False Bomb. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Otten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.